Chair Keith Barnie, a colleague working in the Crawford School. He's an environmental geographer who looks a lot at Laos and Chinese investments in Laos, but hand over to Keith.
Okay. So thanks everybody for our second session. My name is Keith Barnie, down the street from the Crawford School. I'm not presenting in this workshop, but I'm enjoying all your presentations. And I focus on, as Ray mentioned, focus on Laos, and of course China is a major player in Laos, so by nature I sort of had to become more familiar with things happening on the Chinese side a little bit as well. So we have three presentations: Adam Laroussi, Ji Li, and Lucy Smythe. We'll get underway with 15 minutes each. And we'll have a discussant, Wen Ting. And thanks, Wen. And I'll exert my authoritarian chair control to require no more than 3-minute questions and 3-minute responses during the Q&A. So if you're thinking about a question, you can polish it to make it nice and concise. Okay, let's get underway with Adam first.
Thank you very much. Since the crisis of 2008, the African market has undergone significant change, and China has strengthened its economic presence in Africa, reversing the stranglehold of Western private groups. Despite new ecological concerns, the presence of foreign economic players has increased, coupled with the growing interest of Western markets in biofuels, green energy production, and organic farming. What is the relationship between Chinese companies' environmental issues and green business in Africa? In order to decipher green neoliberalism and its empirical implication for Chinese companies, my research focuses on an analysis of this political phenomenon on the borderline between developmentalism and environmentalism. Secondly, my research compares the relationship between Chinese and European companies and activities linking economic productivity and ecological constraints in 3 African countries: the PUPT electrification project in Ivory Coast, Côte d'Ivoire, the challenges of hybrid rice in Burundi, the Dandora biomass power plant in Kenya. My hypothesis is that Chinese companies are embracing green neoliberalism and adapting to African realities in order to seize the continent's new economic opportunities. Please note that this work does not seek to cast anathema on the environmental cause, but rather to highlight the fact that the ecological object can be co-opted by foreign firms, including Chinese ones, in order to develop a discourse that ensures the survival of their interests without necessarily guaranteeing the real development of African countries. While environmentalism aims to protect the planet, green neoliberalism sees it as a market value on which it is possible to capitalize. The growth of the African economic market has thus brought with it a new form of governmentality, understood as a thoughtful way of governing, according to Foucault or Dimier, and advocating economic growth that does not come at the expense of ecological action. Like developmentalism, green neoliberalism is based on the dissemination of theoretical knowledge in the service of international actors, on the legitimization of a system of power for the benefit of elites, and on the objective claim of a governmental discourse, which in reality turned out to be fundamentally subjective, according to Escobar. This form of government aims to ensure the conditions necessary for long-term economic growth by advocating a pragmatic and parsimonious policy that limits the depletion of resources, encourage their renewal, and thus ensure their long-term profitability. We will now look at the relationship between Chinese companies and the PUPT program in Côte d'Ivoire. Since its launch in 2014, the PUPT program, in French, Programme Électricité pour tous, has aimed to make Côte d'Ivoire the regional leader in energy transition and electricity distribution in West Africa. The PUPT project offers a payment system that allows Ivorians to obtain a meter and an electricity connection in exchange for an initial payment of 1,000 CFA francs, 1.53 euro, which is apparently affordable whereas the purchase of a metro outside this program will cost 150 times as much. These low-income households benefit from a reduced rate for the installation of the metro because of their social status, but will spend an average of 200 or 300 CFA francs per day to pay for the installation for 10 years, which in Ivory Coast is the equivalent of 2 baguettes of bread. Nevertheless, the PUPT program maintains that the program's clients have the capacity to repay their installation over 10 years due to their main activity, farming, which is presented as a reliable source of income. PUPT's objective is also to guarantee access to electricity for 100% of its population by 2025, compared with 80% at present, by means of a subtle household debt strategy. In order to increase the share of green energy supporting the PUPT program, the Chinese group Sino Hydro has been asked to build the Soubré hydroelectric complex under the supervision of Société des Énergies de Côte d'Ivoire, a state-owned Ivorian company. According to Amidou Traoré, managing director of Société des Énergies de Côte d'Ivoire, the dam had 275 megawatts to Ivory Coast electricity capacity. This dam was inaugurated in 2017 and was also financed by a loan from the China Exim Bank for 85% of its construction cost. And that's not all. As part of the PUPT program, China, alongside the World Bank and the African Development Bank, is also financing the energy sector through projects that include electrification infrastructure in rural Ivory Coast. As a result, 500 localities will be connected by Chinese funding, while only 400 will be connected by the African Development Bank and the World Bank. Chinese companies are also heavily involved in the Ivory Coast Power Grid Development and Rehabilitation Project, PRODERCI, launched in July 2018. PRODERCI is an ambitious project designed to support the PUPT project by considerably improving the state of the electricity network. At a total cost of 460 billion CFA francs, PRODERCI was 95% financed by China Exim Bank and 5% by the Ivorian government. What can we conclude from the Ivorian case? Chinese companies are heavily involved in the PUPT program, whether in the construction of the Soubré hydroelectric complex, the renovation of electrical infrastructure, or the granting of credit to support the construction contracts. They are happy to partner with the Ivorian state and do not hesitate to share the Ivorian market with other foreign economic players. Furthermore, the involvement of Chinese companies in the PUPT programs represent a commercial advantage for Ivory Coast, since by contributing to the increase in electricity production, the Ivorian government can increase its regional electricity exports and strengthen its position as the leader in electricity in West Africa. What's more, their involvement is also an economic advantage, as the PUPT program makes electricity more accessible to rural populations and creates new economic activities. Finally, the development of hydroelectric complexes by Chinese companies is a political advantage for Ivory Coast, which can thus present itself as a model of ecological development in the region. However, some negative effects can be observed. Firstly, the Chinese companies involved in the PUPT program have a responsibility in the mass indebtedness of Ivorian households due to the subscription credit strategy promoted by the Compagnie d'Électricité Ivoirienne. Secondly, Chinese companies are increasing the Ivorian government's technical dependence on Chinese know-how, particularly by building and renovating energy infrastructure. Thirdly, Chinese companies are fostering economic dependence by encouraging the Ivorian state to take on debt through offers of bank loans coupled with construction contracts. We will now look at the case of Chinese companies. operating in Burundi's agricultural sector. Hybrid rice has been promoted in Burundi by China to boost food security. The cultivation of hybrid rice could solve problems such as the low production capacity of varieties, the poor quality of seedling, and irregular cultivation. The problem with these plants is that their fertility is reduced from generation to generation, so they have to be reproduced in the laboratory every year. Mr. Yang Huad, head of the Chinese agricultural experts at the Gihanga Agricultural Technology Demonstration Center in Western Burundi, says this not only protects the environment, but also significantly increase production and income for the local population. According to Diomed Darurokie, Director General of Land Management, Irrigation and Heritage Protection at the Ministry of the Environment, Agriculture and Livestock, at least 13 of the country's 18 provinces are now growing hybrid rice with the aim of fulfilling Burundian President Evariste Ndayishimiye's slogan, "May every mouth have food and every pocket have money." The Chinese company Cellco Corporation, a subsidiary of Power China, has become more deeply involved in the sector by building the Burundi Agricultural Demonstration Center in 2020. Based on the standards of the China Agricultural Demonstration Center, the project aims to provide Burundi with an agricultural technology demonstration facility that meets the country's agricultural needs. The expert visited fields in the country's 14 rice-growing provinces to carry out research and trials, and introduced 8 varieties of hybrid rice seed supposedly adapted to local conditions. The hybrid seed promoted by the Agricultural Center contribute to some extent to protecting the environment by reducing the use of pesticides and chemical fertilizers. These agricultural seeds are also help to ensure the country's food security and to raise the standard of living of rural populations by increasing the profitability of agricultural activities. However, this farming practice make Burundi very dependent on Chinese companies, since agronomic research into hybrid rice is carried out in China. What's more, the Burundian farming techniques linked to local varieties are being replaced by Chinese farming techniques adapted to hybrid rice, making Burundi dependent on Chinese techniques. Finally, Burundi is forced to import new hybrid rice seed on a regular basis in order to overcome the fertility and productivity problems that hybrid seed has experienced over the generations. We now turn to our final case study, the links between Chinese companies and the Dandora biomass power plant project near Nairobi in Kenya. The situation at this urban landfill is catastrophic. Around 2,000 tons of rubbish a day from Kenya's capital are dumped in the Dandora landfill, which cover an area of around 15 hectares, including chemical waste. To solve this problem, the Kenyan government wants to launch the Dandora Waste to Energy Plant project, a 40 megawatts bioenergy project planned for Dandora by 2025. It aims to process 2,500 tons of municipal waste per day. The power plant will be a joint venture, and the selected foreign company will be responsible for construction, financing, and operation, with a concession period agreed with the Kenyan authorities. A number of companies have expressed interest in the project, but Chinese firms clearly dominate the preliminary list of companies seeking the contract. Indeed, of the 18 companies interested, 8 are Chinese. The companies include China National Electric Engineering Co. Ltd., China Machinery Engineering Corporation, and others. The entire investment for the design and installation of the plant and the operating, running, and maintenance costs are borne by the company or consortium for the duration of the contract. This biomass power plant is likely to have a number of positive effects. It will treat urban waste, create jobs, increase electricity production, and distribute it under the control of the Kenyan government, which will probably ensure that it's accessible to the local population. But biomass power plants are more expensive to maintain than conventional plants, which is an economic disadvantage for the Kenyan government once the contract expires. Africa has today become a competitive economic market, encouraging the development of a new economic assets, ecological capital, by promoting the establishment of economies in line with international environmental concerns. This interest in green development has been facilitated by the sustained liberalization of African economies. However, this has made them more vulnerable to over-indebtedness vis-à-vis foreign economic players. In this respect, Chinese firms have major advantages in the competition that pits them against other foreign firms in Africa. First of all, these companies have a certain capacity to adapt to the conditions of activity and cooperation determined by the African states, which are still very marked by the weight of the public sector in the economy. In this respect, Chinese firms are willing to enter into partnerships with the African public sector and to make ambitious long-term commitments, requiring a degree of cooperation between firms, and the best example of this behavior can be seen in Ivory Coast, where there is a synergy between Chinese banking and construction companies. However, Chinese companies can also generate significant social problems by investing in primary economic sectors, agriculture, energy, by feeding a de facto economic or technological dependency, by participating in public projects whose social benefits are questionable, like the PRPT program, or whose ecological benefits are limited. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Adam. Please keep your questions in mind for Adam, and we'll proceed on to superpower rivalries with Ji Li.
All right. Thanks again to Greg and Debbie for organizing this event, and it's wonderful to meet with colleagues who are interested in the same general topic. So let me. I have only 15 minutes, so let me jump right in. So a brief introduction about the general background. Right, the U.S. and China are locked in this confrontation, and from the U.S. side, a bipartisan consensus has been reached that regarded China as the existential threat, long-term threat to the U.S., and the only country that both has the desire and the capacity to really challenge U.S. dominance in the world. Even the war in Ukraine has now changed that, right? Initially, people thought, well, Russia invasion would create a distraction, but soon the U.S. government expressed clear intent that they're still focused on China. Russia is a temporary threat. China is the #1 strategic threat. All right, so and that rivalry has manifested in the area of law. So increasingly, the U.S. government has enacted rules and regulations aimed at containing China, undermining China's development. In response, the Chinese government has adopted countermeasures, right? Laws and regulations that aimed at mitigating the effect of U.S. laws and regulations. Okay, so that created that rivalry, legal rivalry, creates a compliance dilemma for transnational actors in a situation where if you are exposed to the dual jurisdictions and you want to comply with the U.S. law, that means you have to violate Chinese law, and vice versa. Okay, so that's a compliance dilemma that has kept executives at multinational corporations awake at night, right? So the question is, what is the global compliance dilemma, right? We want to unpack this general quandary. And how impactful is it, right? To what extent it's affecting transnational legal, economic, and political order? And how vulnerable multinational corporations to this kind of dilemma, and what their coping strategies are, and how do we analyze the coping strategies and their implications? All right. So there's a vast literature on compliance. There's a narrow definition of corporate compliance, which says, well, as a company, you have to follow the law, right? It's that simple. And then there's a broader definition of compliance. You not only have to follow the law, you should also conform with social norms and ethical rules. So that's the broad definition of compliance. All right, so in this article, for this paper, I used the narrow definition because the broader definition is still being questioned by some scholars. And in this field, scholars have approached the compliance question from different theoretical angles. And the first one is the rational choice angle. Basically, compliance is an optimization question, right? Companies will invest in compliance to the extent the marginal cost equals the marginal return, the marginal benefit from the reduction of compliance risk. It's that simple, right? And then there's a normative perspective led by Tom Taylor, saying, well, people will comply with law if they think the law is legitimate, if they think the procedure is legitimate and fair. So that's the idea, right? The companies will comply with the law if normatively they consider the law to be legitimate and justified. All right? So, and then there's the bounded rationality approach. You're probably familiar with the concept, right? Individuals are not just cost-benefit optimization actor. People have these heuristics, they have schemas, they have biases. All those will be reflected in their compliance decisions. So they tend to make compliance decisions in a way that is most favorable to their interest. All right. So, and then there's the last approach, which is more a constructive approach. This is the general, the fundamental framework is created by sociologists, right? Instead of treating compliance as a top-down process, a state enacting a law, then implementing it, coercing regulated actors to comply. This camp treats compliance as a bottom-up process, right? Regulated actors, through their interactions with the regulators, actually define compliance and also carve out the boundary of compliance. So in the end, it's really a bottom-up interactive process, not a top-down process. So those are the four theoretical frameworks. I will borrow from them, but I think they are inadequate. Why? Because all this existing literature has been focusing on two broad questions. One, why do we still observe so much non-compliance? Right, that's one. And second, how do we improve the situation? How do we nudge corporations to be more compliant with the law? But they haven't really asked the question, which is, what if compliance is impossible? When you are caught in the US-China legal rivalry, compliance is simply impossible, right? If you comply with US law, you violate Chinese law. And if you comply with Chinese law, you violate US law. So 100% compliance is simply impossible. So no one has explored this question. So this paper will take the first step in that direction. All right. So I'll give you a few examples, right? How this legal rivalry is so abstract. So let me give you some examples. One is the rivalry between U.S. sanctions and Chinese anti-sanctions. So, U.S. government has several sanctions rules and regimes. So, for example, the entity list, which I'm sure you are familiar with, right? Huawei is on the list, right? Increasingly, you see more and more Chinese companies added to the list. So it's just one set of U.S. sanction rules implemented through the entity list. So this is August. By August 2022, more than 600 Chinese entities have been added to the entity list, and one of them have been added by the Biden administration. So this is already outdated, right? Each month, more and more Chinese companies are added to the list. It's going to explode pretty soon. And China, the Chinese government hasn't really been sitting idly, right? So in response to the US sanctions, and the Chinese government has implemented legal countermeasures, starting with the unreliable entity list, right? It's a tit-for-tat reaction. It was proposed on May 31st, 2019, right after Huawei was added to the entity list, right? So it's clear what the intent was. The goal is to identify foreign companies, foreign entities, which have blocked, cut off supplies to, and discriminated against the Chinese entities based on non-commercial considerations, for example, complying with US law, and which has resulted in damage to China's related industries or have threatened or potentially harmed Chinese national security. So basically the idea is if you comply with US law and you cut off your transactions with Huawei, you violate Chinese law. Okay, so what do you do if you have transactions with Huawei and you are exposed to the US jurisdiction? It's no easy answer, right? Okay, so that's the first step, first countermeasure. Soon after, we get another rule, right? This is now the unreliable entity list. We have a MOFCOM published rules, another countermeasure. Basically, adopted the EU blocking statute. This is the EU countermeasure to US sanctions. Excuse me. So the idea is, again, that's pretty straightforward. If you comply with US sanctions and you cut off your transactions with Chinese entities, you'll be punished under Chinese law. All right, so more formally, we have soon after that, 2021, the People's Congress enacted anti-foreign sanctions law. So now we have a national statute in response to U.S. sanctions rules. So the idea is pretty much the same. Draws a copy a lot of the principles from EU blocking statute, but also gave private parties the right of action against business partners who, because of U.S. sanctions, actually cut off business transactions with the Chinese parties. And also, they have obligations to report to the Chinese government if they suffer such damages. All right. So basically, U.S. sanctions, Chinese counter-sanctions, you're caught in the middle. What do you do, right? Time flies. That's just one example, right? This is another example, Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act. So this rule says Chinese companies listed on the U.S. stock market must open their books to U.S. inspector, the PCAOB, for inspection. If not, then they will be delisted from the U.S. stock exchange. The collective market value of all these 200 more Chinese companies listed in the U.S. is more than $1 trillion. So if this happens, it will have a great implication on the global capital market. All right, so but they can't do that. The Chinese companies couldn't do that for a long time, right? They have been discussing this for almost a decade. Why? Because by opening their books to foreign inspectors, they violated a bunch of Chinese laws. So again, the Chinese companies are caught in a legal robbery between U.S. and China. So that's another example, and we have more. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act says, well, you cannot, if you want to export anything to the U.S. market, you have to show sufficient evidence to satisfy U.S. customer officers that none of your goods or products are sourced from Xinjiang. All right, so here we have very vague standard. How do you produce a sufficient evidence, right? That will satisfy the customer officer, right? You need collaboration from your Chinese business partners to produce the evidence. But in order to do that, the Chinese partners will be violating, in theory, Chinese anti-sanction laws, right? So that's one. And the rivalry doesn't have to be symmetric, right? So this TikTok ban was a presidential order issued by Trump as an executive order, right? But it came into conflict with revised China export control regulation, which says, well, ByteDance simply couldn't sell TikTok to a U.S. buyer because that would require a government approval by the Chinese regulatory agency. So ByteDance, before this revised rule was publicized, ByteDance was considering selling TikTok to Cisco, right? If you follow the story, but then because of this new regulation, that was out of the question, right? That was that plan has to be shelved, and ByteDance has to consider other options, not this one, not the direct sale. And this is another interesting case. Bank of China was sued by Gucci to submit account information of Chinese individuals to facilitate Gucci's lawsuit against some copyright violators. Well, Bank of China couldn't do it. Okay, just 1 minute. All right, I'll skip this. So how impactful is this? You know, we heard a lot of anecdotal stories, but to what extent is this impacting Chinese multinational corporations? So based on a survey I did 2017 with China General Chamber of Commerce in the U.S., this is before the U.S.-China trade war. At that time, already 20% of Chinese companies had some experience with conflict laws between U.S. and China. And this is a 2022 survey of Chinese companies operating in the U.S. Almost half of them consider U.S.-China legal rivalry to be a challenge for their compliance with U.S. law. All right, so this is a serious issue, and it has a broad impact on Chinese investments. And then I did some regression analysis and look at what, half of them, right? Only half of them, and 20% of them. So what explain the intercompany variations? So this is a large regression, very preliminary analysis. State ownership is highly correlated with the likelihood that a Chinese multinational corporation will suffer the legal impact of the conflict law. And sectoral regulation is, this is the measure of the complexity of the sector in which Chinese corporation operates. So if a sector is heavily regulated, then it's more likely, this is higher than 1, so it's more likely that the Chinese company will have will suffer this compliance dilemma. And mode of entry is significant. So if you start in the U.S. as a greenfield investment, you are more likely to have this dilemma. But pretty intuitive, right? The findings. I mean, especially this one, right? State-owned enterprises. They're subject to a specific set of rules in China, and now they are scrutinized in the U.S. by various regulatory agencies. So it's not a surprise, they're more likely to face the compliance dilemma. All right, so what do you do if you have the compliance dilemma? Well, So slightly half of them will say, well, obey U.S. law. Note that these companies are operating in the U.S. This should be their natural answer, right? But more than half actually say, well, we don't have principled answer. We'll do cost-benefit analysis. All right. So with that in mind, what are the coping strategies? I ran out of time, so just
1 minute.
1 minute? All right. So the theoretical approach is new institutional economics. I argue that we should look at right now the existing research just try to look at two possibilities: compliance or non-compliance. But they treat the form as the unit of analysis. My argument is that we should take a step back and look at the reason of a multinational company exists in the first place. Why do they exist? Right? If you look at the neoclassical economic argument, the spot market is the most efficient one. Right? Everyone should trade on the spot market. We shouldn't do it through corporations. It's a waste of money. It's not efficient. But Coase and his followers, companies exist because by vertically organizing transactions, they actually reduce transaction cost. And that justifies their existence in the first place. All right, so multinational corporations exist because by organizing cross-border transactions vertically within the corporation, they can reduce transaction cost. Okay, so that's why we see so many multinational corporations. And they organize most of the cross-border investment and trades we see today. However, a compliance dilemma has increased the transaction cost significantly. Right? If we see the dilemma as a transaction cost. Therefore, there are three types of strategies. Organizational strategy, compliance strategy, and reform strategies. Right? So the first one, organizational strategy, we will see increasingly more and more disintegration among multinational corporations. The cost, increasing transaction costs, no longer justify vertically organizing cross-border transactions. So a lot of multinational corporations will divest. That's one way to do it. Or they will dilute internal control. So they will say, well, we have a subsidiary in China, and now we dictate what they do, what they not to do. But in the future, because of the US-China legal rivalry, we'll let the Chinese subsidiary just do its own stuff. We no longer control them. That way, the non-compliance will no longer be attributed to the US headquarters, so that the US headquarters will be in compliance with US law, and the subsidiary will be in compliance with Chinese law. So both parties are happy. All right. Compliance strategies, so companies will invest a lot more in finding compliance tactics that will somehow help them stay in compliance with both sets of laws. In the interest of time, I'll skip the example. And the reform strategy. Now, multinational corporations, if they want to continue, if the saving of transaction costs is sufficient to justify the continuous vertical integration of cross-border transactions, they will continue to do business as one multinational corporation, but then they will spend more money on lobbying, on changing the legal environment, right? Try to either lobby the Chinese government or the US government to make the compliance environment less hostile. All right, so lobbying is just one way to do it. You can litigate, right? ByteDance, TikTok, has used the litigation strategy in order to handle the compliance dilemma. All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ji. Our third presenter is Lucy Smythe. I note former Financial Times journalist and lecturer at University of Melbourne.
So, I'm a journalist, and I am looking at what we're thinking about here with Chinese companies, really from a journalist or a media angle. So it's a little bit different, maybe, from some of the other papers. But some of the things that we've been talking about, and it's really exciting to be talking on the second day, means that I can see some threads from other people's research which are actually really interesting and sort of reflected in my own findings. So I've been thinking about Chinese investment in Australia. I left the Financial Times, I moved to Australia, and when I got here in 2015, Chinese companies were doing a lot of investment. And as a journalist, I was looking at this and thinking, well, it's really interesting the way Australian people are behaving towards this investment. And so that's what got me thinking about this as a research question, looking at that idea of the way the media has portrayed the tension between fear and greed. It's the old Tony Abbott phrase. In the relations between China and Australia and the implications that it has for policy, public policy, not just investment policy, but public policy generally. So I chose to look at 4 big deals over a 12-year period, and I'm going to talk to you about the first one, Rio Tinto. So it was a longitudinal study. It starts in 2008, so it's backgrounded by the Great Financial Crash. And I started with a content analysis of 3 newspapers here in Australia, the Australian Financial Review and the Sydney Morning Herald. And then I supplemented that with semi-structured interviews with journalists who wrote about those deals. Now, I'm looking at business journalism because it's an elite discourse network. It's where the discourse between decision makers happens, where politicians and business people who lobby them and who are lobbied for cash at election time and other interested parties. It's where that level of public debate happens. And there was unprecedented interest in Rio Tinto. So this is a Factiva search of the number of stories that were written about Chinalco's bid for Rio Tinto. And then we've got the others there, the bid for Cubby Station in 2012, the bid for Ausgrid in 2016, and then Bellamy's Organic, which sort of spread into a Lion Dairy bid in 2019, 2020. And if we just look at the numbers, Rio Tinto really caught the imagination of journalists in Australia. So my content analysis did this. It looked at the stories by length because I want to know that they're not just little news in briefs. It looked about where they are in the paper. Are they at the front of the paper or are they hidden away in the business section? And even though it hurts me as a business journalist to say it, business journalism stories that are in the back section just aren't as important as the ones that are in the front. I looked at the genre. Are they features? Are they news stories? And I looked at voice. Who is the person who is largely quoted? What's going on there? I looked at national interest and national security and noted whether these things were written about in the story. I thought that they were going to be seen as 2 very separate things. They were seen as quite more separate in 2008. They became increasingly blurred by people who were talking about them as the decade moves on. And then I categorised by theme, and I looked at what does this story look like overall? Would an ordinary reader come away from this story saying, I see a China threat from this story? Would an ordinary reader come away from this story thinking, this is a pro-business story, this is all about market economics? Would a reader come away and say, well, it's pro-business, but it's got this little nudge of anxiety about it. China isn't an ordinary investor. These Chinese companies aren't ordinary investors. And I called those ones China caution. We've got neutral, and then we've got protectionist as well. So when we're looking at national interest, because it started to blur so much, I think the question is worth asking, what is it? In Australia, foreign direct investments have to be approved by the FIRB, the Foreign Investment Review Board, and those rules have changed about how big the size of the investment is and what sorts of investment the FIRB looks at, and that's changed repeatedly over the years. But where I am in 2008, looking at Chinalco's bid for Rio Tinto, this is Wayne Swan. He's the treasurer. The FIRB will make a recommendation. He will then make a decision. And he says this. He refuses. He refuses to say what national interest is. And he says it's just a case-by-case thing. And this becomes interesting because if the government doesn't define what national interest is, then somebody else will. And they did. As the decade progressed, more and more people jumped in to say what they felt national interest was. This is towards the end of the decade. Here we are in 2020, and we've got two brilliant quotes illustrating really the standoff there between the idea of whose national interest. If it's our national interest, then is it our economic national interest? Is it our national security interest? So this is Helen Sorzak, the Australia-China Business Council chief, saying we need to keep on top of it, but not to the detriment of our economic affairs. She goes on to say, if the spooks were managing our economic interests, this country would go down the gurgler. Peter Jennings, on the other hand, in the same article, says the business community needs to understand there's more to national interest than their business interests. This idea of just shut up and take the money from China position of business leaders, he said, was thoroughly discredited. So that's the who of the national interest from business leaders. And here's another person who weighed in at the time. Chinalco was making a bid for a stake at the time in Rio Tinto. What it was actually doing was disrupting a previous bid that had been made by BHP. BHP is run by this man here, at the time the chairman, Don Argus, and he had a big idea about BHP and Rio Tinto joining up and being this national champion. The idea that this upstart Chinese company should come along and disrupted his brilliant idea got his goat. He was very alarmed about this and said that he felt that what was good for BHP was going to be good for China. This is a quote from Barry Fitzgerald, mining correspondent at The Age, who went on to talk to me about it and said that the quotes that Don Argus was making were frankly jingoistic, and he said, was it anti-Chinese? Was it anti-communism? Probably all of the above. There was a jingoistic sort of nationalistic overlay to the sorts of things that Don Argus was saying and the way that he was lobbying government here in Canberra. I was thinking about, Stefan, your thing when you had Angela Merkel calling the business leaders in the KUKA moment and saying, and I think you said that was in 2012, this was a story from 2015 about something that had happened in November 2014, where Angela Merkel had asked Tony Abbott, what's your policy about China? And he had said, yes, we're just driven by fear and greed. I don't know if she was hoping for a more nuanced answer. So all of this is really coming from this idea of national interest and why the government was trying to avoid defining national interest and why other people did want to talk about national interest, was coming out of that idea of Tony Blair's fear. So what sort of fears were being expressed in the newspapers? And here I looked at a methodology that Lang and Liu did in their 15-year investigation of US coverage of China. And they found that there were three main China threat categories. And they're all coming from this same understanding of disruption to the global system, which is caused by the rising China neo-realist prophecy. And they said, we're looking at ideological threat, we're looking at military strategic threat, and we're looking at economic threat. And in their study, which only goes up to 2006, ideological fades out really fast by 1994. Military starts to rise in 1995, but the thing they start looking at for the last 6 years of their study is this economic threat. When I was looking at my content analysis, it's almost all economic threat. Now, that's not particularly surprising. I was looking at business stories after all. It makes more sense for me to find a majority of economic threats. And the ones in the Rio Tinto stories then were replicated over and over again in other deals that I looked at. And this is resource control, fear of monopoly, price manipulation, fear of scarcity of resource. And so if we think about the deals that I look at later on, we're looking at farmland with Cubby Station, we're looking at electricity, the poles and wires with Ausgrid, and we're looking at these things: sovereignty, price manipulation, and scarcity. That gets much worse when we're looking at Bellamy's organic milk, when various people start claiming that Australia will run out of raw milk because it will all be exported to China. So it's not just the threats that were being made, but it's also who is making the threats. And these threat assertions that are turning up in the newspapers are being made by politicians, they're being made by business people, they're being made by defence analysts, economists, journalists, opinion writers, and letter writers. And that's quite interesting because letter writers are obviously the audience. People are writing in with their concerns, and sometimes newspapers are publishing those concerns well in advance of their opinion writers or leader writers expressing those concerns, that the audience appeared to be, or at least a curated section of the audience that they are publishing about, appeared to be more concerned about a China threat than the editorial stance of the newspaper itself. Great. So how much of a threat did journalists see? And the answer here in 2008-9 is not a lot. As the decade progresses, that changes. Things don't always add up to 100 because of rounding. So we're not seeing this enormous threat at all in 2008. But we do, so I split it up. This was a long bidding process. Chinalco came in February 2008. They bought up 12% of Rio Tinto. They didn't ask the Australians for permission. They said, oh, well, we're buying it on the London market. It was a dawn raid. And we didn't ask your permission because we didn't think we had to. They then did ask permission, and that's our second column here. Wayne Swan gives them permission, not just for the 12% they bought, but he says you can go further. You can go to 14.9, but no board seat. There's a second bid that then gets made This is all with the background of a worsening financial situation. So by February 2009, we've got China Co wanting to raise its offer for Rio to now 18%. Rio shares had sunk like a stone at this point. And then we've got the final bit here when Rio and China Co part ways, because they haven't had, Wayne Swan kept putting off a decision about whether they were or weren't allowed to buy that 18%. We can see in the yellow lines here that generally speaking, let's ignore the middle one because the AFR was a little bit odd around the 14% approval, that we start to see things getting more anxious around China threat towards the end of that situation. So here we want to say, well, who's defining that threat? If Wayne Swan wouldn't define the threat, then it falls into, if we use Bennett and Hallin's theories here of indexing and the theories of debate, Hallin's theories of the debate of consensus, controversy and deviance, we could say that if the press, according to Bennett, usually follows what the government defined line in issues of national security or foreign news. If the government doesn't define that line, then it falls into this area where anybody else can. And that was really what was happening. It was in the sphere, as Hallin would say, of legitimate controversy, legitimate debate. People talked about whether they did or didn't think that this was a good idea. As the government changes its mind over the next 10 years, then we start seeing the press doing the same thing. And my last slide I want to leave you with is how important at this point, so this is part of Bennett's theory again, how important are the people who are making the threats? Lovely picture of Barnaby Joyce for you here, which everybody in Australia will know him as a Australian politician. He's very against any kind of investment by Chinese companies. He was making noise in 2008, but he wasn't important in 2008. He was a senator. He wasn't, as he would later become, an MP, leader of his party, and then deputy prime minister. At that point, when he's saying the same sorts of things, he gets a lot more attention in the press. And I'll stop there. Sorry.
Our discussant is Wen Ting.
Yeah.
Wen.
Yeah, thank you very much for the very insightful presentation. I learned a lot from that. About Adam's presentation, your presentation is encouraging in delving into the interaction between the Chinese companies and the green evolution taking place in the Africa, and very appropriate and insightful empirical case studies about the PEPT programs and the hybrid rice farming in the Burundi. So my question is what policy recommendations can be made to foster the better environment practices among the Chinese business, given your research? And what do you foresee the evolving relationship between the Chinese business and the African countries in the context of the green movement? And about the Ji's presentation, very engaging talk. And I benefit a lot from the broader law literature review on the global compliance dilemma, and it can shed light on the ongoing China-US global superpower rivalry in the law landscape. So my question is actually, you mentioned there is sometimes ambiguity in the laws in the US or China that the global companies can navigate and justify their company policies. So I'm very curious about how the lawmakers make the laws for the companies? Do they pursue the clarity, or sometimes they will intentionally, strategically leave the ambiguity there for the companies to navigate so that they can leave some room for the companies in doing the international business? So about Lucy's presentation, speaking to very insightful about the involving medium's role in defining the Australian national interest. So I have the two questions actually. The first one is, why do Australian leave the national interest or the China threat more ambiguous recently to leave the room for the medium to interpret or to define the national interests? Why such national interests became more vague recently? So is it for the strategic purpose, or it just depends on the bureaucratic preferences? And also, I'm very curious, like how the Australian newspapers usually justify the tension between decoupling from the China for the national security purpose and the Australian commitment to the liberal trade principles. For example, in the US, we see like how the Yellen used the framing friendshore and saying that we rely on our US allies to in a supply chain goods. So we commit to the liberal trade principles still because we trade with the allies and we still reap the benefits of the efficient resource allocation. But at the same time, for the national security purpose, we will decouple from the China and strengthen the resilience of the US supply chain. So I'm curious about how the Australian will like accommodate this kind of tensions. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much, Martin. So we'll go for short responses to give a chance for additional questions, hopefully. No more than 2 minutes. Adam, would you like to respond to that?
The question is about the recommendation to African countries in their relation with China, or the recommendation to China about its relation with African countries?
The Chinese companies, I think.
Okay, Chinese companies.
As far as the implications, of course.
Okay, I think that Chinese companies need to be more, more careful when they did business with the business with the African regime, more specifically with authoritarian regime. Why? Because with this the non-inference concept of the Belt and Road Initiative, China deals with everyone. But with this concept, they even deal with some African regime who didn't really want to develop the country by the right way. They will develop their countries, the regime. I mean the African regimes. Some African regime want to develop their countries by using some financial some financial help from foreign actors, and with malicious intention. For example, if you see, I didn't talk about the Egyptian case, but it's a very interesting case. In Egypt, there is some faction in the Egypt regime, because it's a military regime, who use the loan of China to build some mega projects in the country, not to really develop the country, but to increase their own prestige and own notoriety, and to feed the competition between their factions or the other faction of the military regime. So China, with its non-inference concept, China is include itself in this bad phenomenon, strange phenomenon, and after that, we can see some bad, even sad situation in Africa. For the case of PUPT, we can see that the Ivory Coast have taken some big loan. When I talked about this, the 85% of the Subre hydroelectrics is insured by the China Exim Bank, and only 5% by the Ivory Coast. What's the meaning of all of this? We see a country who take some loans that it will be very difficult to reimburse and to end. So I think that China maybe have to reinterpret and maybe change its diplomatic strategy vis-à-vis African countries to be more to increase their. For example, I recommend to China to increase its cooperation with institutional regimes. Generally, it's democratic regime, but not necessarily. But when
We'll have to wrap up
okay,
soon, Adam.
I can
Last point.
thank you. The last point. Can you repeat the question for the last point? Thank you.
What do you foresee the evolving relations between the Chinese companies and the African actors in the green evolution?
What-
The future.
The future of the relation. I think that the China will continue to help and to support and to increase its cooperation, economic cooperation with the most indebtedness and most poor countries in Africa, because it's an opportunistic strategy who is very useful to China. Because why? Because I think that in the near future, the authoritarianism and the clientist and neo-patrimonialistic model have a good day, will be more and more common in Africa. We can see this in Mali, we can see this in Burkina Faso, so there is a lot of example, and this regime are marginalized by the West, so they will naturally ask for help to China. So I think that China will increase its economic presence and political presence in Africa. It's sure.
Okay, thank you, Adam. Professor G, would you like to respond?
Yeah, sure. A very good question, actually. I didn't have time to really lay out the framework. Actually, I treat the compliance process and legal rivalry as an ongoing, dynamic, interactive process between three parties: the two rival states and the multinational corporations as a group. So they interact at the lawmaking stage, and then they interact at the compliance stage, and then they interact again at the law enforcement stage. And then the whole process loop back to either compliance or lawmaking. So it's a recursive process, dynamic. I didn't really have time to elaborate, but your question really to answer is the lawmakers will look how what the corporations do in terms of compliance and how the law is enforced in the field by the regulatory agencies. And then they take into consideration, they update their information and then bring that back to the lawmaking stage. If they decide, well, for example, the US government wants to strictly enforce the Uyghur Forced Labor Act, well, then they will give more details, give more instructions to the regulatory agency to strictly enforce, and that would narrow the field for compliance, right? Will narrow the possibility for applying compliance tactics. Actually, if you ask U.S. lawyers will always say, well, give me for a good price, I can help you get away with any law, right? But in the end, you just perceive it as a transaction cost. If you're willing to pay a high enough price, you can get away with. But the question then goes back to the earlier one, right? Is does it justify? Does the cost justify, continuing to do business as a multinational corporation? Maybe you can just revert back to the spot market, right? Exit the market or dilute the control, sell it off, right? If the compliance cost is too high. All right.
Okay, thank you, G. Lucy.
Thanks. So thank you so much for your question. I think it's a really interesting one because it's quite hard to look back, isn't it? We're where we are in Australian-China relations, and we know what is being written now in newspapers and the sorts of tone of the newspapers. But it's quite hard to cast our minds back necessarily and spot changes that happened. And the AFR, for example, the Fin Review, would always say it has been strongly in favour of liberal trade principles.